Would you watch this movie? A journalist who has become very vocal against his government walks into the Saudi consulate in Turkey. His fiancée is waiting outside for him. A few hours later, somebody walks out wearing his clothes and his glasses. But it's not him. He has disappeared. His fiancée raises the alarm. Turkish authorities begin investigating. Intelligence agencies get involved. World leaders are demanding answers. And the man at the center of all of this is never seen alive again. Would you watch the movie? What if I told you that this was not a movie? This is the story of Jamal Khashoggi. By 2018, Jamal Khashoggi was living in the United States. He hadn't been forced out of Saudi Arabia, but he no longer felt comfortable there. There were restrictions being tightened and more critics found themselves being silenced. So Khashoggi chose to live abroad. Many people described it as self-exile. From America, he continued writing articles for the Washington Post that were read all around the world. Journalism was nothing new to him. He had spent decades working as a reporter, an editor, political commentator. He had interviewed princes, government officials, some of the most influential people in the Middle East. In fact, years earlier, he had interviewed Osama bin Laden multiple times, but this was before 9/11, before the manhunt, before he became the most wanted man in the world, okay? The two men knew each other personally, and Khashoggi would later say that he tried to persuade Osama bin Laden to abandon violence. If you look back at Khashoggi's life, he seemed to have a front row seat to some of the biggest stories in modern Middle Eastern history. But politics was not the reason that he was in Istanbul. Love was. He had fallen in love with a Turkish researcher named Hatice Cengiz, and the couple were planning to get married. For that to happen, Khashoggi needed documents from Saudi Arabia proving that he was divorced from his previous wife. Now, to get those documents, he would need to visit the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. On September 28, 2018, he walked into the consulate for the first time. The staff were polite. They told him that the paperwork would not be ready today, and they told him to return a few days later. So he made another appointment for October 2nd to come back and get the documents. On the 2nd of October, Khashoggi arrived at the Saudi consulate with Hatice Cengiz. She waited outside while he went in. This visit was supposed to be quick. He was simply collecting documents that were needed for the wedding, that's all. At 1:14 p.m., CCTV cameras captured Jamal walking into the Saudi consulate. That would be the last confirmed sighting of him alive. Hatice waited outside for Jamal. He seemed to be taking a bit longer than usual, so she waited, and she couldn't even call him because before entering the consulate, Khashoggi had handed her his phones. Then 3:30 p.m. came. That's when she really started panicking. Before going into the consulate, right, Khashoggi had told her, he gave her strict instructions. If anything happened to me, contact my friend. His friend was called Yasin Aktay, and he was a senior advisor to the Turkish president. At the time, it just felt like a precaution. He just had a feeling. Now it felt like something else. So she made the call. By evening, people were asking a question that should have had a very simple answer. Where was Jamal Khashoggi? Saudi officials insisted that there was nothing to worry about. According to them, Khashoggi had already left the consulate through a back exit. But Hatice had been standing outside for hours and she hadn't seen him leave. Why would he leave without her? And if he really walked out of that building, there should have been some sign of where he went next. Instead, it looked as if he had just vanished. Throughout all of this, Saudi officials stuck to the same story. Jamal Khashoggi had left the consulate, but investigators were now reviewing security footage, from around the area. And what they found only created more questions. Okay, so at some point that afternoon, a man was seen leaving the consulate wearing clothes that appeared to belong to Khashoggi. The same style of jacket, the same glasses. At first glance, it looked promising. Maybe the Saudi officials were right. Maybe Khashoggi really had left. But there was just one problem. The man in the footage was not Jamal Khashoggi. Turkish investigators would later identify him as a Saudi man named Mustafa al-Madani. According to investigators, Madani had changed into Khashoggi's clothes after Khashoggi had entered the building. Then he had walked out, trying to copy the way Khashoggi walked, dressed like him. If Jamal Khashoggi had already left the consulate, why did they need somebody else to dress up as him? This footage did not answer any questions. It made everything worse. Then they found out that the Saudi consulate employees had been told to take the rest of the day off after Khashoggi went in. That was a very troubling detail. So investigators started pulling at every thread that they could find. Flight bookings, hotel bookings, security footage, everything. Before long, a strange picture started to emerge. On the very same day that Jamal Khashoggi disappeared, a team of 15 Saudi men had arrived in Istanbul. Some arrived on private jets, others came on commercial flights. Many of them only stayed in the city for a few hours before heading back out again. That was very unusual. Then investigators found out that among these 15 men was a forensic specialist, a man whose work involved autopsies, forensic examinations. So his job was basically working on dead bodies. Why was he here, all the way from Saudi Arabia? By this point, Turkish investigators no longer believed that they were dealing with a missing person. They believed that they were investigating a murder. The question was, what happened inside the consulate after Jamal walked through the door? According to Turkish prosecutors, Khashoggi was killed shortly after entering the building. Investigators believed that he was taken to an office inside the consulate where those 15 men, confronted him. Exactly what was said remains unclear, but there are some reports based on transcripts, that were reviewed by the Turkish authorities. Khashoggi was told that he would be returning to Saudi Arabia. He refused. What happened next has been described differently by different sources. But the conclusion is that he was killed by strangulation inside of the consulate, and his death had been planned in advance. Anyway, according to Turkish prosecutors, Khashoggi's body was dismembered and his remains were removed from the consulate after his death. And this is where it becomes very, very frustrating, because Khashoggi's body was never found. Despite years of investigations, searches, international pressure, his body was never found. Think about that. This is one of the most famous murder cases in modern history. One of the most investigated, one of the most discussed. And nobody outside of those that were directly involved knows what happened to his remains. As pressure mounted, Saudi Arabia's explanation started changing. At first, they said Jamal Khashoggi had left the consulate. Then later, they acknowledged that, he had died inside the building. Later, they said, no, he died during a fight in the building. And they said, wait, that team of 15 men had been sent to persuade him to return to Saudi Arabia and that things had gone wrong. People wanted to know who was behind it. And that was when attention turned to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. He was the crown prince of Saudi Arabia and one of the most powerful people in the country. Saudi Arabia has consistently denied that Mohammed bin Salman ordered the killing. But several investigations have reached a conclusion that points to him. So a United Nations investigator later concluded that Khashoggi's killing had been planned in advance and carried out by the Saudi state agents. Then in 2021, the United States released a declassified intelligence report. That report concluded that Mohammed bin Salman had approved an operation to capture or kill Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia completely rejected those findings. The Crown Prince rejected them completely too. But by now, the case had become an international scandal. Governments around the world condemned the killing. Several Saudi officials were hit with sanctions, travel restrictions, and what had started as the disappearance of one journalist turned into a diplomatic crisis. Saudi Arabia eventually put several people on trial over Khashoggi's death. Some received prison sentences. But while the arguments about responsibility continue to this day, one thing has never changed. Khashoggi's body was never found. Hatice, his fiancée, became one of the most visible faces of the campaign for justice for Jamal Khashoggi. After raising the alarm outside when he failed to leave the consulate, she spent years speaking publicly about the case, giving interviews around the world, meeting political leaders, pushing for accountability. They never got a chance to get married. To this day, many people still believe that the actual person responsible for giving the order has not been punished.